Hello, I'm with Nick Brotherwood here at the Church Planting Canada Congress. Nick is someone that I've known for a few years. He he was part of the One Size Fits All documentary talking about his church plant in Emerge, and over time we've noticed that a number of church plants that were actually featured in the One Size Fits All documentary are no longer operating in the way that we first met them. Uh, and Nick came to Church Planting Canada Congress to talk about what's changed in his church, and why church plants fail in general. I consider Nick to be a very courageous guy. Glad to have him here, talking to us a little bit about why church plants fail. So Nick, welcome to the big show. Oh, get you in. There we go. So, tell me a little bit about what happened with Emerge. Was this a quick end to that church plant, or was it a little bit longer?
It was probably a a slow and lingering death, really, rather than a quick sort of sudden death experience, or it wasn't an execution. We started in 2003, and it came to a close at the end of last year, 2010. So 8 years span. Um, Also, things were, I only was ever working on the Emerge project half time, so
Okay.
I always needed a second half time job to keep body and soul of my family together. And in September 2008, I started as assistant director of the Wycliffe College Institute of Evangelism, concentrating on developing Fresh Expressions Canada. And that was something I'm very much, I can do one thing. I'm not a good multitasker.
Okay.
And and that was taking my attention. Up to that point, Emerge basically had taken all my attention, and
Right.
whatever. And I had a variety of other half-time jobs that they always came second to the Emerge project, which was occupied me for probably 6 years, which is pretty good for me. And as I say, September 2008, working on Fresh Expressions. This is something that's new, and was engaging me in a way that the Emerge project had initially, but was doing so less and less. And so my attention was shifting, and people were noticing. And at first, I think it was my wife who was noticing. I was reluctant to admit it because it's not something you'd like to admit.
Right.
But it was happening. I was beginning to realize it, but was unwilling to admit it. My wife was noticing and saying, "You're not putting your full energy into
Okay.
it. That's not right. You should be." And I was feeling guilty, which I should have been, feeling guilty about that. And so we began to start talking about, and also at the end of I think that year, or maybe the following year, I was asked to apply for a job, which I ended up not getting, but it meant that I had to raise with our planning team, which was the group that made decisions within Emerge, say, look, I may be having another job which
Yeah.
would require me to relinquish most, if not all, of my responsibilities with the Emerge community. How would you guys handle that?
Right.
What might you do? And this was the subject that no one wanted to talk about.
Okay.
Not surprisingly, they didn't want to talk about that.
Right.
I tried to raise it, and also through the last year, 2010, I continued to raise that, and I'd begun to talk with my bishop about that. I felt that this was a change was coming up. He was encouraging me to talk about it with the community. This was extremely difficult to do.
Okay.
We tried to do that. We tried to get a community sort of, oh boy, not mediator, but animator in,
Okay.
to help us do that. But it was quite difficult to do that, and there weren't really any realistic proposals coming up from the Emerge community for ways in which the Emerge community could continue without me having a paid half-time
So
fee.
it basically ended
Yeah,
right
and
there.
the diocese said we cannot go on any longer subsidizing your half-time position. And they gave me plenty of warning, which gave us at least 5 months
To warn things.
to look at that. And again, coming to decisions. Well, we didn't. It just kind of stopped.
Right.
And then people had to decide what they wanted to do. So it wasn't the best way of finishing, but it was a conclusion.
So you were called by God to plant this church. How come it didn't work out? Did you not hear from God? What happened?
Well, I think I was called by God. I think we got that part right, or I got that part right, to plant this church. And that's where I get a little bit hazy. I think God called me to do something. The intention of Emerge was to connect with not yet, or at least my intention was to connect with not yet Christian 18 to 35-year-olds in downtown Montreal. And what happened is we actually ended up connecting with Christian 18 to 35-year-olds in downtown Montreal who had become disconnected from the forms of church in which they'd grown up. And so the form that the Emerge gatherings took were really my interpretation of this call. So I wouldn't want to say that God's call was faulty or failed. I think the way that I understood or interpreted God's call or superimposed on the essential kernel of God's call my idea of what that might look like.
Okay.
I sort of, God gave me that call and I just took off and ran the Nick Brotherwood way without actually or without referencing God terribly much about, okay, God, what does this look like?
Okay.
I assumed that I knew what this should look like, and I went with it. So I don't want to pin failure on God and say it was God's fault. No, I think there were reasons. I think the assumptions that I made were actually faulty.
Okay.
But that essential call by God, no, I believe I was called by God to do something that had to do with 18 to 35-year-olds.
One of the things that has popped up for me in the workshop that you did, and I invite people to download that and listen to it, but you had suggestions for denominations about what they can be doing for church plants that do fail or do end.
Yeah, I guess my piece was fail to meet expectations because failure is a human category that it's a label we pin on or stick on certain people, certain things. This is a failure, that is a failure. In my personal processing of the experience of failure to meet Nick Brotherwood's expectations for Emerge, I had to realize that the failure was failure to meet expectations because God was doing something. Often God was doing things that I hadn't realized, I hadn't intended, I hadn't planned for. God was at work. So I think we ought to be extremely hesitant to stick the label of failure on it. Well, I mean, lots of people did stick the label of failure on the crucifixion.
Right.
But God had another point of view.
Right.
So,
do you have ways that you would want church planters to be supported in this time period?
Yeah,
like, are there things you're learning of that?
No, absolutely. I think, again, it goes to expectations, and we've talked about personal expectations of the planter, but there are also expectations of the sponsoring body, the judicatory, to use a term. What are they, and where did they come from? Did they come from the experience of the history of that sponsoring group? And what was that history? Because my tribe, the Anglicans, have got a history of planting churches basically only within Christendom here in Canada.
Right.
It's always up until the late 1950s, it's been Christendom. We knew how to do that kind of church plant. We have got little experience in planting churches in a post-Christendom context. So I think there is a questioning of expectations that needs to take place all the way around, including the planter, including the sponsoring group that's sponsoring the plant, and also parts that were missing or parts that got ignored. There was a sort of a knee-jerk rush to do this because it seemed to be a good thing. Yes, we should be planting churches. Yes, we need to connect with 18 to 35-year-olds. Just let's get out and do it. And we didn't take I didn't take the time to actually to go, well, what might that mean, God? I didn't spend the time to listen to God, to listen to the culture, because obviously the 18 to 35-year-old culture is not my culture. And so that I was functioning as an immigrant into a culture that wasn't my native one. So I need to do even more listening.
Okay.
Because of that. And there was a institutional pressure. No, we want you to perform.
Right, right.
Which in our tribe means you do services, worship services, which I wouldn't advocate that as the best thing to do first. And so I think in our rush to do this stuff, we forgot to sort of get clarity. Well, what is the vision for this? And is this God's vision, or is it merely Nick Brotherwood's vision for this?
Okay.
Or even the denomination's vision? Is this, to what extent do we think this is God? And what might we bring in Scripture to reference that? And actually, where do we get that idea? Is there anything that we can connect? Are we looking for connection points in Scripture? And also I think I paid scant attention to the need of a coach, like an outside, more objective voice.
Okay.
I didn't have that, and I think that was a mistake in hindsight. Also, we never considered what happens if this doesn't work according to what we thought working was going to look like. That wasn't a part of it. There's a natural aversion, and I understand it. We don't want to talk about failure again. It's uncomfortable. It makes everyone feel uncomfortable. You don't know how to react, and so that's a piece of it that I think if we're going to adopt a more responsible attitude towards church planting, that needs to be part of it. And how do we reach out pastorally to the church planter or the planting team that are involved with this? Because they go through this on an emotional level that touches themselves personally, and their families go through it. And so what is there going to be provision there for that? And how might that happen? And also, how do the institutions that sponsor these churches, how do they process the experience when it doesn't turn out the way we had all hoped and expected? Something else happens. How do we process it? Can we only either consign it to the failure heap or the success heap? Can we look at it differently and say, what have we learned through this? What was God up to? And maybe we missed a lot of what God was up to because we were looking for certain indices of success, which were our indices, but they may not have been God's. And so I think that there is a real we need to get clarity on this, to try and as much as we can. And I'm not suggesting we can do this perfectly, but we can attempt to be honest about our own expectations. And are we just trying to co-opt God for support and credibility, or actually, and also, is it okay for us to recognize that what we think is the way to go might not be the way God? And I do see in Scripture that the Garden of Gethsemane, you had the astounding situation where you have God the Son and God the Father apparently having different wills. Not my will, but your will be done.
Yeah.
Wow, if within the Godhead there can be slightly different wills. So is it not going to be possible for us to have different wills to God? And do we always need to claim that what we think is a good idea, well, it must be God's will? Well, maybe it's not. And maybe we need to be secure enough in our relationship with God, saying, God, please have a look at what I think is your will. And if I'm wrong here, please show me. And to be open about that. We need to, I think, be able to develop a culture of honesty. And we need to release the pressure of these indices of success, most of which come from our culture, not from the kingdom. And I think God's given us this wonderful opportunity to revisit this and say, to what extent have our values been corrupted, and we've adopted basically cultural ones instead of working to try and see what are the kingdom values here. And I think that's an ongoing process that we need to engage with.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for talking with us. I definitely want to be talking again. I'm very interested in this. And again, I just want to say thank you for your courage and for being willing to tell this story and continuing to support people on the journey toward church planting. So thanks, Nick.
Well, you're very welcome, and I hope it's useful to some people.
Great, thanks. Oh,